Hi, this is just a brief overview of a history lesson on Canada. Approximately 32 million people live in Canada according to the 2006 census. Canada has approximately 10 million square kilometers, which makes it the second largest country in the world. Approximately 75% of the population live within urban centers. 75% of that population lives within close proximity to either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, and of these cities, a majority of them are within the 2-hour Goldilocks range, which is the range close to the Canadian and US border. In 2015, approximately 271,000 new permanent residents landed in Canada, which again is another increase from the previous year. The countries that are immigrating into Canada consist of people from countries like the Philippines, France, United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Mexico, Ukraine. You can imagine what the English may sound if all those people did speak English. The countries with the largest influx of immigrants into Canada had little to no exposure to the English language. And in many cases, the ones that did have exposure to the English language, English would be considered their third language. So there was some work to do for the Canadian government to try to integrate these people. Canada consists of 10 provinces and 3 territories. One of these provinces does not have English as a first language. Instead, it has French, which is called Quebecois in Quebec. Canada does recognize French as an official language in addition with English, so therefore, Canada has 2 official languages. As mentioned earlier, Quebec is the only province that considers French to be the first language and English as a secondary language. The remaining provinces and territories all consider English as a first language. To fully understand what Canada is about, we must look back into history and find out the details of where the immigrants arrived from, which obviously are quite different than what we see today. Canada was first discovered by French explorers. Shortly after, the British explorers started arriving in their boats, ready to settle. But as you can imagine, as history books have taught us, it's not comprehensible to presume that the French and English could coexist quietly. But because of what was happening back in Europe between England and France, there would be obvious tensions that would arise in Canada, and therefore the battles did pursue between the English and the French for territory inside of Canada. The English eventually did win, and by that they gave the French a consolation prize, and the consolation prize was the territory of Quebec. During the American Revolution that was occurring, there was another mass exodus of British loyalists escaping the newly independent United States. These British loyalists were the largest amount of English-speaking people immigrating into Canada during this time. The mass exodus of British loyalists escaping from the newly independent United States, they were settling mostly in the eastern Canada. In addition to what was occurring in the United States regarding the American Revolution, many people from Ireland were immigrating into Canada as well. There was another mass exodus that was occurring due to the fact of the potato famine. In addition, Britain did see another exodus after the Napoleonic Wars. So after the British exiled the French and gave them Quebec for them to farm and legislate, England decided the best thing for them to do for Canada was to do a campaign to bring in more immigrants, English-speaking immigrants, into the country and give them opportunities of farming their own lands that they weren't given back in Britain. So in 1850, Canada opened its doors and allowed a mass amount of immigrants to come with the dream of farming their own lands. During this time, in the 1850s, Canada was not independent from the monarch. It was still under British rule. This again happened between 1950 and 1970. But by this time, Canada had its independence. But Canada opened its doors for a different reason. Canada opened its doors to allow another mass migration into Canada from places like the United States, from Europe, the Philippines, wherever they could find talent. And they needed to acquire this talent so that they could compete on a global level. Because as globalization was continuing to grow, Canada needed the technology and the people who had the experience for them to compete. So by the early 1970s, it was apparent to the Canadian government that the current population in Canada recognized that there was a dilution of culture. Instead, there was this melting pot of cultures that were brought upon. But as many politicians looked back and said, this isn't a melting pot of different cultures. This is more of a mosaic. So therefore, they spun it in a positive manner so that the Canadians that were currently residing there, and they could be first generation Canadians, were accepting these changes. So by realizing that many of the immigrants that were coming to the country were not English speakers to begin with, so the government instead started to look into creating programs where they could teach English to some of these immigrants. But as the people in Canada already saw, this was starting to become problematic.